Uh, Hi all, welcome back to the channel. I'm here today with Tyler Hildebrand and Thomas Metcalf, both philosophy professors who published a paper recently on the nomological argument. Nomological means having to do with laws. Nomological argument for the existence of God. It came out in Nous, which is a very good philosophy journal. It's I think a pretty intriguing argument. Also maybe a bit difficult for people without, a background in metaphysics and specifically some of the literature around laws of nature and that sort of stuff. So we're going to be talking about that, trying to make it a little bit more accessible maybe. And yeah, so maybe we can start out with just like the elevator pitch version of the argument. What's going on here?
Yeah, sure. We're happy to do that. By the way, Dustin, thanks for having us on.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks, Dustin.
Okay, so I'll give a quick overview of the argument, starting with an analogy. So suppose that we're playing a game of poker, and that when I'm the dealer, I deal myself a straight flush on 5 consecutive hands. Naturally, you're going to suspect that I'm cheating, because although it's logically possible for me to have received those hands by chance, it's extraordinarily unlikely. In contrast, you can think of reasons why I might want to cheat. So you would naturally take this observed sequence of hands as evidence that I'm cheating. So our argument in the paper has that same sort of structure. So we say, look, to start, let's just consider 2 hypotheses that try to explain why we observe regularities or patterns in nature. So if you look around, you'll see that in the natural world, there are all sorts of examples of predictable, repeatable patterns. Massive objects attract. Sorry, excuse me. I'm fighting off a bit of a cold. Planets have elliptical orbits, so on and so forth. And we can ask, well, why is nature like that in the first place? Like, why are we lucky enough to live in a world in which science is possible, in which the world is this predictable kind of place? What ultimately makes sense of that? So there are different hypotheses about what could have brought that about. So one option is analogous to the chancy hypothesis in our game of poker. It might be that nothing explains why there are patterns of events in nature. It's just a brute fact. Things had to be distributed somehow, and we just happened to arrive in a world in which things are orderly. But they don't have to. Nothing like binds them together. Nothing is out there imposing structure on nature. This kind of view is called Humeanism in the literature. So that's one sort of option. The question then is, can we think of others? Because in the same way that it seems unsatisfying to say that I received this string of straight flushes on the basis of by chance, it might seem a little unsatisfying to say that there's no ultimate explanation for why our world contains observable regularities or patterns. So historically, the leading prominent candidate back during the rise of modern science was that God was responsible for the regularities. So in the same way that a cheater imposes structure on a deck of cards, you might think that God imposes structure on the natural world. So the nomological argument is basically a way of taking that fundamental insight or building on that analogy and showing that of all the different sorts of competing explanations of regularity or order that you might find in the natural world, ones that incorporate some sort of personal supernatural being are better than other competitors. But there are a lot of competitors in the metaphysics of laws. There are a bunch of options. So one of the things we do in the paper is try to set out the argument in a more precise way that does justice to some of these really interesting competing theories.
Yeah. So the initial analogy with dealing cards, the thought there is something like, look, the dealer has this, highly fortuitous string of cards that he gets, and that is just the probability of like some really good one is just, the probability of like, what are the super good hands divided by all the total hands or whatever. And that's going to be very, very low. And then, even if you start out thinking like the dealer is probably honest or whatever, nonetheless, like the chance that he might cheat and deal himself a really good hand is like higher than the chance that he's going to just deal himself some randomly selected hand, right? And so the chance of the really good hand on the dealer's cheating hypothesis is higher than it is on the this is just randomly selected hypothesis. And so that in Bayesian terms, that means that it's evidence that the dealer is cheating. And, the greater the difference is as he gets more and more good hands, and it becomes, the proportion of the probabilities becomes greater and greater, the stronger the evidence is, such that at some point you're going to think, okay, obviously this guy is cheating. And then the thought is there's something similar going on with the existence of regularities in nature, or at least if the alternative is this Humean view, it looks like there's something similar going on. Because I guess on Humeanism, it's almost like, like any state of the universe could follow from any other state of the universe. And really, there's no particular reason why it shouldn't. The laws of nature that we observe are merely descriptions of like what actual patterns exist, but there's no reason that any patterns at all or any interesting patterns at all should have existed. And so I was kind of thinking, it's almost like, I don't know if this analogy is helpful to anybody but me, but it's almost like if you imagine the universe as sort of a flip book, and like each drawing in the flip book is a state of the universe at like the next nanosecond or something. On Humeanism, it's almost like the way the flip book, like the flip book, you should sort of think of it as if it was created in this way. Like somebody made an infinite number of like every possible drawing, and then they just selected a bunch and shuffled them together. And like that's the flip book. And then, but then it turns out when we flip through the flip book, actually, we have this totally coherent, orderly narrative in the real history of the world. And like, wow, it just seems astonishingly unlikely that would be the case on the Humean view, whereas it's at least not astonishingly unlikely that would be the case on some sort of design hypothesis, because a designer might be, even if you're pretty unsure about the designer's intentions and whatever, it at least seems like there are some reasons to think that a designer might be interested in a world with certain sorts of regularities and so forth, such that it would be more likely than just any other randomly selected sequence of flip books. Is that like a fair statement of the initial?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
You've got the basic idea, right?
Yeah.
We've got this observation, and then we take our candidate hypotheses and ask how well the hypotheses make sense of that observation. And the problem for Humeanism is that it seems really improbable that they would occur. So even if you were pretty fond of Humeanism in advance, once you realize that it struggles to make sense of why we have any regularities at all, it shouldn't be as attractive a view. What we spend most of our efforts doing in the paper is asking the question, well, how does this sort of, we call the view that God is responsible for the regularities divine volunteerism, because the idea is that the regularities flow from God's will. The first question is, does this actually give us a good, satisfying explanation? As you mentioned, we can think of reasons why a God might care about worlds with these such things, and so there's more to say about that. But on the surface, it's not obvious that it's easy to do this, because you might think that the question, what does God want, is really difficult to answer. So there's a lot of work to be done in developing the argument there. But then we also have to look at all of these other competing explanations.
Right.
So if we're allowed to posit a God to try to explain something, other philosophers, other metaphysicians, they can posit other sorts of entities too, like Platonic universals or natural kind essences or what have you. And so we need to also look at those competing theories carefully and ask the question, how well do they do at explaining the regularity of nature.
Right. So yeah, maybe we can go through the pro divine voluntarism part of the argument. Yeah, there are at least some reasons why this isn't wildly shocking on divine voluntarism, and then we can go through some of these other alternative views of the laws of nature and explore whether they seem like they can do as well as the divine or even anywhere near as well as the divine voluntarist hypothesis. So yeah, I guess one question before we get into the specific the specific reasons that a designer might be interested in order or in regularity. One thing that's interesting is you're not necessarily assuming anything about the moral character of the designer in advance, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's something that I think a lot of maybe listeners are going to be wondering, how is this different from traditional biological design arguments? How is this different from traditional fine-tuning type arguments? And there are definitely some similarities, but one of the things we really try to do in the paper is to say, maybe we can get by merely not saying much more than that this is an intelligent being. And intelligent beings can even conceptualize the idea of a pattern or regularity. And there's no particular reason to say it has to be morally good or it has to value any particular kind of regularity or any regularity that gives rise to any particular creatures wandering around in the universe. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an interesting difference, because often traditional design arguments, they're assuming something about divine psychology, so to speak. They're assuming that God is interested in producing value. God is morally good, at least to some extent.
Yeah, and we're hoping that maybe we can just assume not much more than that there is a psychology at all. Maybe from the mere fact that it's an intelligent being, it doesn't, as you say, it doesn't necessarily have to say that this being would therefore be more likely than not to create regularities. But what we try to argue is that it's therefore at least more likely than chance, right? If it can even conceptualize regularities, then there's some chance it cares about them. And we hope that that makes it more likely than just pure random chance to create regularities.
Yeah, and you go through some specific reasons why a designer might be interested in regularities, involving moral and aesthetic properties and compressibility and that sort of stuff. Maybe you want to say some stuff about that.
Yeah, let me say a little more. So on the one hand, as you mentioned, like if we are building into our theistic hypothesis that God is good, like morally good, or that God has aesthetic preferences, and that his aesthetic preferences, if he thinks that, so there's something that aesthetically attractive about order, which maybe a lot of us do, right? Then of course, you then raise the probability that he would want to create a universe with these regularities in it, right? And so that's fairly familiar, I think, when if you have a background in knowing about natural theology, knowing about other design arguments. I don't know if I want to call this a design argument. As we say a little bit, it's got an interesting position, sort of like a cosmological argument too in some ways, but for now we can call it a kind of design-like argument. If you're familiar with those, then it'll be fairly straightforward to say, well, we don't think maybe it's extremely unlikely that God would be morally good, or that there'll be a morally good God, or a God with aesthetic preferences. And so that follows then that he's going to be more likely than chance, we argue, to create regularities, but not just because regularities might be beautiful in themselves, but because they might be necessary to create some of the things that a morally good being might care about, right? So, and this is a place where there's some similarities with fine-tuning arguments, right? It might be that if there were no regularities of any kind, then maybe creatures couldn't encounter certain morally relevant experiences and maybe form decisions or attitudes about them, saying like, I want to help this person, or I appreciate the value of goodness, or so there's all those examples that if there were no regularities, right, then if there were just no kind of causation, anything that resembled the kind of deterministic order of causation events that we see in our universe, then maybe there's not going to be a lot of room for that kind of thing, right? Or maybe there would be very, very difficult for a being to have a kind of a personal identity over time if there were no regularities. And so, obviously there's a lot more we could say about what there needs to be for a creature to be a moral agent, but I think you can maybe see where we could go with that. But beyond that, there's just a more general idea that, you mentioned some compressibility. So, I think it can be kind of intuitive idea where if, a string of 10 zeros in a row, well, how about this? A string of 100 zeros in a row. I just told you the total content of that string in a very short, fragment of a sentence. If it wasn't like that, if the ones and zeros were apparently sort of randomly distributed, I couldn't just say 100 zeros in a row, right? I might have to start reciting them to you, right? And so that's a way of expressing how the first case, the 100 zeros in a row, is in that sense compressible. I compressed the description of it into a simple 100 zeros in a row. But if it's really like 110 0 1 0 1 1 0 0 1 1 1 0 1 0 0 1 0 1, et cetera, it's going to take me, a minute or two to recite them all. And so if you think about regularities, right, you might notice that regularities are also the sorts of things that can be expressed in that kind of compressed way, right? If I give you a statement of some law of nature, some, gravitation or something, I don't have to give you a long list of all the possible, every moment in the universe, every spatiotemporal location in the universe, what's happening there, right? That would take me a very long time. So in that sense, you might also think that a being that has a mind, can understand this idea of compressibility, there's just going to be more ways for it to choose those kind of more likely than chance to choose. It may care about the compressible version of it. It may not just care about this long string of ones and zeros. That's my attempt to explain more of the technical point of the paper, but that's another reason a being with an intelligence might care about order, even if it wasn't morally good or cared that much even about beauty.
Yeah. Oh, were you going to say something, Kyler?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to add that when it comes to moral and aesthetic qualities, like we naturally think about like good qualities. And it's obvious that a lot of these good qualities require underlying regularities. So for example, if you think about like what it's like for a sentient being to be in a state of pleasure, there's an awful lot of complexity going on in their brain state. And it has to be just so in order to give rise to that kind of experience. It requires these very sophisticated patterns and regularities out there in nature. But the exact same is true for negative moral and aesthetic qualities. So, if you've got a deity that's, a bit of a jerk, that being too what might have good reasons to create a world with regularities, because it won't be possible to bring about the kinds of disvalue properties that they care about without doing so. So I wanted to make that point just to emphasize that when Tom was saying, like, we don't need to appeal to a traditional theistic God in order to give this kind of explanation. We don't have to assume that God is morally perfect. All we need is to assume that God is this personal kind of being. That's a way of kind of understanding why that might be the case. So
right. Yeah. So there's kind of the general thought that just like an intelligent agent might have some sort of preferences regarding regularity. And yeah, that seems, if you like traveled to some other dimension and you were on a planet of like interdimensional beings and you think, I just have no idea how these things think, but I know they're intelligent. And then you find a flip book telling a coherent narrative. Even if you're like very uncertain about their psychology, you'd think, okay, probably they made this flip book and they didn't just shuffle pictures around. They were trying to tell a coherent narrative. And then there are these more specific things that maybe partly help explain that if the world is just kind of like a chaotic mess where things are just totally jumbled and unpredictable, then there are all sorts of moral and aesthetic qualities that it's going to lack. And so if there's some chance that the intelligent agent has some sort of preferences regarding realizing moral and aesthetic qualities, then that might make it more likely that we have a world with certain sorts of regularities. And then also there's this sort of technical point about compressibility where you can like give a much shorter description when there are certain sorts of regularities. You can give a much shorter description that like doesn't lose any information. It tells you everything that's in the longer pattern. Whereas that's not true of just like a chaotic jumbled mess of things, because there's no pattern. There's no way to compress everything down into a shorter description. And compressibility, the thought is an agent might have, might select by saying, I want to make a universe according to such and such principles or something. Some shorter string, some shorter description, and a totally chaotic universe with no regularities, there aren't going to be any compressions because just things are happening in no discernible way that can't be easily described. Whereas the ones with regularities, there are going to be compressions, and often there will be multiple compressions that describe the same series of events. And so, an agent, I guess they could choose just through the long exhaustive description, or they might choose via one of these compressions. And so in some sense, there's like, if you assume maybe some sort of indifference reasoning or something, there are like more ways of choosing, or maybe more possible choices or something that would lead to regularities as opposed to ones that just lead to a chaotic mess, something like that, I guess.
Yeah. So John Stuart Mill suggested that one way of answering the question, which set of statements count as laws, is as follows. We take this small set of statements such that if we knew them, we could then deduce the rest of nature. And so the idea here is that when we call something a law, we're honoring it in a certain way because it's one of these statements that allows us to deduce a ton of other stuff from it. It's an extraordinarily useful, powerful kind of statement. So when you frame it in that way, you might think, look, worlds in which nature is highly compressible can be described completely without loss in a few very elegant statements. Those might be the sort of thing that might be of interest to an intelligent being.
Right.
I mean, that's of interest to physicists. So this is one of the reasons why scientists value, and sometimes even they'll use aesthetic language when describing the theories they like. They'll talk about the equations as being beautiful and elegant and things of this nature. So those kinds of qualities align nicely with this notion of like nature's being compressible into a small elements set of descriptions.
Yeah. So you've given an argument that like we don't really need to assume very much about the designer's psychology in order to get the conclusion that this would be evidence for design. Do you think that we could like infer anything about the designer's psychology from the existence of the regularities we see? Like, does it support any particular conception of the designer over any other, or would we have to make that on some other ground?
I think it's hard for me. That's an interesting question. I think it's hard for me because I haven't thought of this very much. But if we had some idea of to what degree the possible regularities, to what degree the regularities we see are as regular as it could possibly be. Like if it turned out that like the world is maximally regular, which I mean off the top of my head I don't think it is, but if it turned out it was like maximally regular, then maybe we say, oh, this is a being that prioritizes regularity above all else, and that's what it cares about, right? And if it turned out that the world is only a tiny shade more than pure chaos, then we could say, well, it doesn't care that much. I don't think that's true either, right? So that's an interesting question, but I guess off the top of my head, I would just say, like, if we had some idea, maybe more of the logical space, and maybe it's possible to do more work and figure this out, maybe we'd at least be able to infer something about, like, is this being like obsessed with regularity, or is it just kind of like it, right? But yeah, I think without having to do that kind of investigation, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'd have to think more about it. But I mean, it might be helpful to go back to the like the poker analogy that we started with. You know, if we were playing and I'm always dealing myself a straight flush, like one thing you might think is, oh, well, Tyler's a really good cheater, or he's very talented at manipulating cards, but he is awful at poker. Like if he actually was trying to win at poker, he wouldn't be giving himself these hands. He'd be a lot more subtle about it. So you could infer certain traits of mind from the specific kinds of sequences. So I'm open to that we might be able to do something similar. But I do think that to a certain extent, what we would have to do is look at the specific kinds of regularities that we have, examine their character, and then that would be maybe better evidence. Whereas in the paper, we kind of just say, look, we've got these sophisticated regularities described with the language of mathematics, but beyond that, like for our argument, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So, but when we start looking at the details, then we might be able to infer more about, you know, what the designer might be like.
Yeah. So it might be, say, that the fact that the regularities we have allow for certain moral or aesthetic properties is some evidence that the designer is interested in those. And
yeah, that's a point, right? That's a point where it might move into some of the other sort of natural theology arguments. I mean, one possibility we might learn, and again, this is just off the top of my head, suppose it turned out that all the regularities were necessary for embodied moral agents, and then we found a whole other area of science that was completely chaotic but turned out to be irrelevant to embodied moral agents. We might say, oh, that's another weird coincidence, right? Maybe this is telling us a little more about what's being cares about.
Yeah, I guess before we move on from this to the other positive proposals, one other thing you talk about in the paper is, you know, somebody might think, okay, I grant that this is some evidence, but like, you know, the idea of a divine designer designing all the natural laws, that's like so implausible going in that, you know, the evidence is not going to make it likely on balance. You know, I can grant that, yeah, okay, it makes it likelier than it would otherwise be, but so implausible otherwise. And so what do you all have to say about that sort of?
Well, I mean, if, you know, given that we've tried to be so minimal in our statement of divine volunteerism, I think, I mean, you mentioned principles of indifference earlier, and those are, of course, controversial, although I think they are more controversial than they really should be. I've tried to do a little bit of work elsewhere dealing with this a little bit more, but yeah, I think that if you like principles of indifference, you know, this is sort of what we try to do in the papers. We try to say, well, let's just try to be very neutral here and schematic and say, what are the possibilities? And we go through that in a way of saying, well, the possibility that these regularities were chosen as an intelligent choice, that's not committing us to a huge amount. And, you know, I will say that if you just find this hypothesis very implausible, I would ask one to think about whether they are maybe tacitly imagining the god of theism or Anselmian theism or perfect being theism or something, right? Like if that's what you're imagining, then maybe that is baggage on there from the rest of philosophy of religion. But if you just look at I mean, if you took divine voluntarism and changed the word divine, right, like just intelligent voluntarism or something, or intentional regularities versus unintentional regularity or something, that might change your attitude a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, so it could be that people are thinking it's super unlikely because of something having to do with the problem with evil or whatever, and you can say, well, we're not, at this stage at least, we're not saying that the designer is morally good. We're just saying it seems like there's some sort of designer, and then we can sort out the problem of evil and other things afterwards, maybe. Yeah, for the benefit of the people at home, so the principles of indifference are like probabilistic principles that say that, you know, if you have multiple different possibilities and there's no reason to favor one over the other, then you should assume that they're equally likely or something like that, I guess. And those are controversial because in some cases that seems to lead to paradoxical results, because by sort of conceptualizing the same situation in different ways, it looks like you can get different results. And it doesn't seem like the probabilities you assign should depend on how you describe the situation or something. So, if I tell you there's a box there, there's a factory that makes cubes. And I'll tell you this much. The cubes are between, like, each side is between 1 foot long and 2 feet long. And then what are the odds that the cubes are of a certain size? Well, you're going to get different results depending on, like, do we partition according to, length? Do we partition according to volume of the cube? Different ways of trying to divide up the space would cause you to assign equal credences in different ways. And then you get inconsistent results depending on how you describe the situation. And so people who want to employ principles of indifference are going to have to say maybe something like, well, there's some privileged way of assigning probabilities. Either maybe this is a special case where the principle of indifference doesn't apply, but there are other cases where it does, or there's actually some principled way of like, this is the right way to describe it and the right way to partition things. And then, we need some explanation of how that is. We don't need to get super into that, but I agree with you. There has to be some solution to that problem, I think, or we wind up with all sorts of other problems. But I don't know. Do you want to say anything about your favored approach to that sort of issue?
I mean, we don't really go into detail in the paper because it's like, this is a whole huge
sure
in epistemology. But like, one quick little move that we can make just to sort of motivate reliance on occasional indifference principles is that without some principle to that effect, it seems like we end up stuck with a very, very pernicious form of skepticism.
Right.
So there's a whole long history behind this, but basically the way that we think of this kind of objection, according to which you just can't give arguments like this because, principles of indifference are false. There's no way to assign prior probabilities. If that's true, we can't do a lot in terms of justifying beliefs. So granting that this kind of thing is possible, we try to show that the moves that would be necessary to make in order to defend our argument are pretty modest. So, for example, we'll say, look, here's like a nice thought about how you might think about prior probabilities. So suppose you decide to start doing metaphysics and you're not really aware of the landscape at all. But you have some conception of how you can slice up logical space. So you might say, well, on the one hand, we've got Humean theories that don't posit any sort of primitive necessary connections. And then we've got these more robust non-Humean theories that do. They're different. One of them posits a little bit more than the other, but metaphysics is this hard discipline. We're really limited. It's not like you can just look out and see that Humeanism is true or something like that, right? Like, we're dealing with these abstract theoretical theories. So maybe you shouldn't, like, if you're assigning probabilities to theses like Humeanism and non-Humeanism, they shouldn't be too different. Like, not by more than an order of magnitude or something. Like, if you care about parsimony, yeah, maybe Humeanism gets a higher probability. But it would seem strange, at least to Tom and I, to say something like, oh, well, Humeanism is 1 trillion times more likely than non-Humeanism a priori.
Yeah,
like, that just seems like a surprising.
Somehow you don't know anything about the world, and we ask you, like, Humeanism, this view according to which the natural laws are mere descriptions of what happens and there's kind of nothing more to them, versus other views like, which do you think is more likely? And you're like, I'm like 99.9999% sure of the first one. That doesn't seem right. Like, it seems like you should be kind of, well,
it seems
if not equal, they should be like similar in probability, maybe. Yeah.
Right. Now, the reason for that is that they seem similarly general and sort of internally equally coherent. In contrast, if you said something like, all right, well, okay, Humeanism and non-Humeanism, they're exclusive and exhaustive. So that's fine, but I can do that again with a different pair of theories. Suppose that either nature consists of exactly 4 unicorns, or that it consists of something else. Well, there we have exclusive and exhaustive hypotheses. But should we assign those equal probability? No, surely not. But the reason is obvious. It's that one of them is much more general, covers a much wider range of logical space than the other, right? So what we try to, one of the things we suggest in the paper is that the way we've defined divine voluntarism, it deserves a non-trivial slice of the pie, so to speak. So if you're, nature, like the space of possibilities is like this pie and you got to slice it up. When you're talking about things like the distinction between humanism and non-humanism, or like non-Humean theories that involve personal beings and those that don't, the categories involved are sufficiently general and all of the theories are sort of equally internally coherent. If any of them are intelligible, the other one seems intelligible. In those sorts of situations, it's hard to justify giving one theory a negligible probability when others have a non-negligible prior. So that's just kind of like a general, the general approach we take. Tom, do you want to add anything?
Oh, just real quick. Thanks. I just wanted to mention that, the principle of indifference is not the only way, of course, to assign priors, right? I mean, it's helpful, but another thing you could sort of say is like, if there are lots of smart philosophers who believe in this theory, then it's not negligible, right? Or you could just assign your priors. I mean, it's a little bit tricky because you don't know how much they're taking into account regularities. You don't know if it's really prior to regularities. But you could say, I'm going to assign my priors based on the Phil Paper survey, right? Humanism gets this, non-humanism gets this. Again, that's not going to work perfectly, but we hope there are just these kind of modest principles that say, look, like if it seems like smart people have defended this and keep defending it and have for a while, then we can't just rule it out before we even consider regularities and their effect on the probability.
Yeah. So one approach is you think about like humanism, non-humanism, no obvious super strong reason a priori to favor one over the other, so we cut the pie in half. Then you identify, what are the other major candidates such that there's no obvious a priori reason to cut the pie accordingly. And once we do that, then we partition everything out. It turns out that divine voluntarism doesn't have a super low intrinsic probability. And then the other is just, well, if there's a lot of expert disagreement, that unless at least you have some reason to think that the experts, there's some sort of, you have some good error theory for why a certain portion of the experts are so badly confused or something, then you probably shouldn't think it's like super unlikely that this theory is true going in. And then maybe another point is, at least in the humanism case, you might think the evidence is so powerful that like the prior probability would have to be super low. Because it predicts regularity so much better than humanism does. And so, you don't need the intrinsic probability to be like high. It could actually be pretty low if the evidence is good enough that it could, if the evidence is good enough, it could still bring it up to be pretty likely on balance at the end.
Yeah, you were talking about cutting the pie in half, and it's sort of what Tyler was saying earlier. We can even cut the pie 9/10 versus 1/10, and then cut the new 1/10, 9/10 versus 1/10. We think it still gives you something, because as you say, especially comparing to humanism, it's just it would just seem very shocking to get those straight flushes over and over and over and over again, and it's worse than that. I think humanism's prediction of the regularities we see.
Yeah. So maybe we should move on to there's humanism. It looks like it does a very bad job explaining regularities. We have this other view that doesn't do a super bad job. But then there are like other non-divine voluntarism and non-humanism views that might do a better job of explaining regularities. So what are some of the other major alternatives to divine voluntarism and humanism, and why is it that you think that they don't do as good a job as divine voluntarism?
Tom, do you want me to just give a rough sort of taxonomy? Okay. I might try sharing my screen so I can draw a little bit, if that's okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think you have to enable it. We also don't have to if you prefer not to. But
let's see here. Did that do it?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
All right, so you see a blank screen?
Yes, yes.
All right. Okay, so suppose that this is the Humean mosaic. So Humeans are going to think that you've got this space-time manifold, and then there are different points in the manifold instantiating different properties. And that's all there is. Everything else supervenes on that, or something like that. So a non-Humean theory is going to change this in one of two ways. It's either going to add some new stuff outside, some kind of new primitives that have modal character, that are going to somehow impose structure on nature, or it's going to change the characterization of nature, like somehow build modal qualities into nature itself, like in there. Some views do both. Now, the thing that's I'll just focus on views that impose primitives outside of nature, because I think it'll sort of help to illustrate what's going on. After I explain those views, and we can talk about potential worries we have about them, we think that the worries for that kind of view, where the modal primitives are outside of nature imposing structure on it, also arise for their analogs that try to build modality into nature itself. But that's sort of we probably don't want to get into those weeds. Okay, so the kind of view we have that I've drawn so far, sorry, computer's being slow. Divine volunteerism says, well, God is out there imposing structure on nature. But you might ask the question, well, could it be something else? For example, could it be just a primitive, an entity that's not a personal being? It could be a non-personal being. It could be something having to do with properties, like laws of nature could be relations between universals. So we've got options here for conceiving of these things. They're all sort of similar in the sense that they're positing this new primitive that's going to then like play this important role. That's part of the reason why we think it's hard to assign divine voluntarism a negligible prior. But the idea here is that in the same way that earlier we were asking questions like, well, what if, God has a different character? Would we expect different things about what goes on here in nature? We can ask the question, well, what if it's not a personal being, if it's something else, what might that say about what goes on in nature? Because we're stuck here in this little mosaic looking around. We can only see this stuff directly around us. So if it turns out that the things we see are not as nicely accommodated by some of these non-Humean theories as by others, we'll have reason for preferring some to others. So the first sort of view that we'll talk about maybe is the view that non-Humean laws are just these primitive entities. So when we say, it's a law that such and such is the case, all we're really doing is saying there's some non-personal entity out there that somehow imposes structure on nature. What gets imposed? Well, just whatever the content of the statement of law is, whatever the such and such is. So if it's a law that F equals MA, this primitive thing just somehow brings it about that F equals MA is true.
Yeah, so this is a view where like laws of nature actually exist, like they're actually objects, like an abstract object of a certain sort, I guess. And one that's they're like sui generis. They're different from any other sort of like class of objects we know of, and somehow they impose order on the world. That's the view, right?
Right. So a proponent of this view might say something like, look, scientists talk about laws all the time. Most of the people, listening to or watching this are probably, you've heard talk about laws before. You're familiar with roughly with what is meant when people call something a law. So we just posit an entity that is suited to do that work. What else can we say about it? We don't say anything else about it, because that all it does, it's posited to do that work and that work alone. There's nothing else about it. It's just a primitive entity that imposes this structure. So that's one sort of view. Do you want to talk about our worry about that view before we talk about property bases?
Yeah.
Okay. So the basic worry we have here is that this merely pushes the explanatory problem back one level. So, when we were considering divine voluntarism, we also raised the question, well, why would God want to bring about regularities? And, we argue that we have a good answer to that question. But now consider an analogous question for primitive laws. Why should we think that primitive laws are the sorts of things that give rise to regularities, as opposed to any other random assortment of states of affairs? Because we haven't said anything about what a primitive law is, it doesn't seem like we can justify an answer like, oh, well, of course laws give rise to regularities rather than something else. There's nothing about, built into the intrinsic nature of a law that suggests that it should do that sort of work. So it seems like I could say something like, look, take some arbitrary Humean mosaic that to us just looks like it's random noise. It's just a totally miscellaneous assortment of particular matters of fact. It could be a primitive law that mosaic gets output. You just have a statement that says it is a law that, and then you have a long description of that world, and there's nothing wrong with that. That seems like a perfectly legitimate primitive law. But it's hard to see why we should think that there's something illegitimate with, or something about that that's problematic, something that would justify saying, all right, among all the positive primitive laws that are out there, the ones that give rise to regularities have a much higher probability than the ones that don't. So the worry is that really the question, why do primitive laws give rise to regularities as opposed to irregularities, is just as hard to answer as the question, why would we get regularities by chance?
Right.
Well,
so for any possible world history or whatever that the Humean believes in, there could be some primitive law necessitating that. And so you have all the same possibilities. It would be almost like if we return to the flip book analogy, and I'm wondering, how is it that it tells a coherent story? And you tell me, oh, I know why. It's because the book was put together by a machine. That's not enough, because there could be a machine that put it together any which way, right? It needs to be something, that has to be something more to the story for it to have any predictive power at all, right? And so the primitive view, you can imagine primitive laws, these sui generis things that necessitate anything. And so unless there's some reason why the regularity producing primitive laws are privileged, then it doesn't actually increase our predictive power at all. Whereas in the divine voluntarism case, you said there are reasons why the regularity producing sets of intentions or something are more likely for a divine designer, for reasons that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and I just for those listeners who are familiar in the kind of idiom of Bayesianism, you can always bump up your likelihood by borrowing from your prior, but in the end you don't actually get any farther, right? And so this is also there's a version of this debate in the fine-tuning argument literature where people say, well, maybe there's just a deeper law that says that like-permitting regular constants will be created, and one of the objections is the same problem. Well, why should there have been that kind of law instead of laws that produced any of the 10 to the 120 sets of non-life-permitting?
Yeah, so I can say, oh, this is how the flip book was made. A wind blew through and blew everything. and you say, well, wait a minute, a wind blowing through, that doesn't predict a coherent narrative. And I say, oh, sorry, let me be more specific. A very special wind blew through at exactly
Right.
the right angle, such
Yeah.
that, blah, blah, blah. And now my theory does predict it because I specified exactly what the wind did. The problem is that doesn't make it any more, that would be like cheating, right? Like that doesn't make it any more likely in the end, because I've predicted the data by making it proportionally less likely going in. And so I guess the relevant move here is going to be the primitivist can say, oh, okay, well, what I mean is there are these entities that necessitate certain and like specifically there are ones that necessitate regularities of the sort that we find. But absent some reason to think that that is more likely than like any other primitive necessitating entity that there might be, that's kind of doing the same thing where you're now, okay, now you predict the data, but you did it at the cost of a corresponding hit to something like that.
Like in principle, it seems like there are postulates that could be laid down that might feel like they get around the problem, but they still feel like they're arbitrary because of how they fit with the claim that these entities are primitives. So for example, if as a primitivist, I said, look, here are some constraints on what kinds of statements can be called laws. Number one, all of their predicates have to be, they can't be like weird, gruesome, gerrymandered predicates. They have to be like natural, like terms that we would use to describe genuine similarities. And second, other things being equal, the simpler a statement is, the higher probability it has. Now, if you say both of those things, you might be able to then say, well, look, this theory allows us to assign higher probabilities to the laws that give rise to regularities than to the laws that don't. Great. But it feels kind of arbitrary. Like it's not like those postulates flow out of the primitivist metaphysic. They're just sort of bolted on. And so it seems to me that if you want to start by saying things like, look, I think laws ought to be the sorts of things that are simple and that involve that are stated using the right sorts of language. We should seek a sort of metaphysics that illuminates why that is the case. And so we think divine voluntarism does, because, since God is a personal being, we can tell the story about why God would care about these kinds of things. But I think it's harder for other sorts of views. Yeah.
So there, you could posit, well, there's some sort of bias in favor of simpler primitive entities. And you're thinking, well, maybe it's not obvious, like absent some ontological explanation for why that is, it's not clear why that should be. And I guess maybe, another thought you might have is like, it seems like the very simplest possible primitive necessitating entities would result in like really boring the regularities we see are actually, they're not like the simplest possible ones, so it's almost, maybe there's like a worry where like what we have are not like the simplest possible regularities. What we have are like regularities that are not like super complex and totally unmanageable, but they're also like complicated enough that cool stuff can happen. And the simplicity view wouldn't predict that, whereas maybe a divine designer view would you can see how that could be, that the designer would be interested in regularities, but not just super boring regularities that don't allow for any interesting aesthetic or moral properties, maybe, or whatever.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. That's Brian Cutter and I have a paper on the psychophysical harmony argument where we make a similar point in response to a similar move. So that's what I'm thinking about. But yeah, Tom, do you need to go?
Oh, I should probably get out, but yeah, thanks. Yeah, I gotta go,
Yeah.
but this has been great, and I'll look forward to seeing the rest of it.
Yes. Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
It's great seeing you, Tom.
Yeah, you too, Tom.
Yes. So Tyler and I will continue on talking about this relation between universals view. I feel like this is one of the more popular views. Is that right? I feel like this is one of the ones I always heard about in grad school. You know, I never read the literature myself very much, but
Yeah, so brief history, way back in the day, so in ancient philosophy, people like Plato and Aristotle had views that they weren't thinking of laws in the sense that we think about them exactly, but they had metaphysics that would have aligned with theories of laws. So Plato, with his universals in Platonic heaven, would have probably, like if he had been around today, he would have said, well, look, I can make sense of governing laws. These things that are out there that impose structure on nature are forms or universals. There's these like paradigms of things. And when they stand in certain kinds of relations to one another, those relations also get exemplified in nature. So this kind of view used to be popular. Then fast forward to, almost 2,000 years, the rise of modern science. Newton publishes his Principia, and then in the general scholium, so this philosophical reflection that comes at the end, he suggests, look, I've been trying to lay down like an account of which principles are out there governing nature. But now I want to quickly reflect on the question, like, why do these principles govern nature? Like, why are these equations correct? How do they work? And he suggests, like, well, it's probably the providence of a divine being. So divine volunteerism was a popular view. Okay, during the early modern period. Fast forward a couple hundred years, empiricism becomes really popular in the guise of logical positivism. People don't really like speculative metaphysics. So they don't want to posit a God. They don't want to posit relations between universals or anything like that. But in the 1970s, a couple of prominent philosophers, after people started becoming more open to metaphysics again, developed non-Humean theories. And the most prominent ones that were developed again, anew, were these universals-based theories. So Michael Tooley, David Armstrong, and Fred Dretske developed ones according to which the universals are sort of imposing structure on nature. And this was probably the first view that really gained traction when analytic philosophers started taking metaphysics very seriously, in the 1960s.
After logical positivism had collapsed, and
yeah. So there's kind of a historical explanation for why that became widely discussed. The classic move away from Humeanism, which was kind of like a default view for the positivists, that was challenged, and there are all these classic papers doing this interesting work and putting forward this view. So I think that one of the reasons why it gets a lot of press is just that historically it played this very important role in making non-Humeanism a respectable kind of position again. But it's also an interesting view that has a lot going for it. So it's a natural sort of place to start if you want to start thinking about non-Humeanism.
Right. Yeah, and what do you regard as the problems with this sort of view?
Sure, good question. So let me say just a little bit more about the view itself.
Sure.
Because I gave this sort of like Platonic version of the
right,
how the view is supposed to work, but that's like a little metaphorical, and so here's a slightly more precise statement. So a universal is like a respective resemblance between two things. So take any two objects, like my hands. They're very similar to one another. There are lots of respects in which they are the same, but there are also some respects in which they're different, right? So what a proponent of universals would say is that each one of these respects that we seem to be quantifying over when we talk about respects of similarity or of difference, that's actually like an entity in the world that gets instantiated in multiple places at the same time. So like roughly speaking, the hand shape is instantiated in like these two places simultaneously, and it's one and the same thing. So
what is the light here and the light here, like they're the same color. Like what is the same color? Well, the color is actually a literal, I can't tell you exactly what the color is because I'm colorblind. It's either blue or purple, but the color is like an actual thing. It's this abstract object that they're both somehow related to or instantiating, participating in, whatever. And that's what it is for them to be the same in this respect, as they really are related in the same way to the same abstract object. Yeah.
Yep. So when we think about like events or states of affairs on this picture, it's this complex thing where you've got, say, like a substratum with properties, and the properties are entities and the substratum is an entity. And so like fundamental facts, states of affairs, events, these are these complex structured things. Now, the question then is, okay, if we accept universals, might that have to do with laws? Like we've been talking about universals as though they're these things that make sense of similarities and differences. So how laws come into play? Well, it's very natural to think about laws as involving properties in an important way. So if you take Newton's second law, F equals ma, force, mass, and acceleration all describe properties of objects. And the law then expresses this functional relationship among the quantities of those relevant properties. So if you're thinking about the law as standing apart from nature, imposing structure on it, it's kind of natural to think like, oh, well, like what it does is it actually like takes the state of nature as a time, and it's like a function where you input the state of nature at a time, and then it outputs the next state, and it adjusts these,
Right.
properties, force, mass, and acceleration on the basis of how everything's working. So the laws should involve properties somehow. So the big question is, okay, how? Well, you posit a special relation, which is itself an abstract entity. It's a higher order relation. So this is like a universal relation that binds first order universals. So for example, if all F's are G's, let's say all ravens are black, you might say, well, being a raven is a universal, being black in color is a universal. And so if it's a law that all ravens are black, it's not, again, but pretend that it is, then you might say, well, up in Platonic heaven, there must be something. There's some sort of special relationship that's holding between these two properties, such that down in nature, all of the ravens are going to be black in color. All things with the first property are also going to acquire the second property. So that relation has this special modal character built into it. So somehow this thing up in Platonic heaven, these things get bound by a relation. And then once they do, that does this work of,
And as you say more, I realize that maybe my grasp of this view is not as good as I as I would have hoped. The relation is contingent, right? Or is it a necessary? Like the fact of the relation is.
You could go either way.
Okay.
Most proponents of this view have held that it's contingent, simply because they want to accommodate the possibility that the laws could have been different.
Right.
So you might want to say, look, so in fact, it's not a law that all ravens are black. Some ravens are white, but maybe it could have been.
Right. Right.
Like that seems to be an empirical possibility. Like it's conceivable that this could have happened. So we want our metaphysics of laws to be able to account for that.
Right.
In general, when we think about the character of physical laws, the necessity seems weaker than, say, logical or mathematical necessity. Like if you're presented with a mathematical necessity, in principle, it's the sort of thing that if you think hard enough about it, you can grasp it.
Right.
But that's not how laws of nature tend to work. In most cases, we learn about what the laws are by observing regularities.
Yeah.
So given that they have this different character, we have to, like, if we want our metaphysics to respect that, we have to somehow make it a bit different. Yeah. So almost everyone either says laws of nature are contingent, or they'll say like gnomic necessity is weaker than like mathematical necessity. It's not exactly fully contingent, but it's all like it.
Yeah.
So there are degrees of freedom for how you want to articulate what these primitives are and the work that they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I guess intuitively there's something. Yeah, I mean, it seems like the laws of nature are contingent, but it seems like there's something just odd about the idea that there's this contingent relationship that universals stand in with each other, presumably for no deeper reason, and that is what makes things in the concrete world go the way they do.
Yeah. So think about it like this. Imagine that we're playing our game of poker, and I have a couple special cards that I put into the deck. And what happens is that if you draw one of these cards, then it tells you what to do, and then you get other cards.
Yeah.
So if I deal myself a card that says, oh, you get a straight flush, like I just get a straight flush.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, this is the rules of this modified game of poker.
Yeah.
In a game like that, receiving a bunch of straight flushes would be less surprising. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So one way of thinking about this, like contingent laws stuff, might be, look, when we posit these contingent relations between universals, what we're doing is saying it's almost like there are these cheat cards up in Platonic heaven, and you don't know which one is gonna like get drawn for a given world. It's sort of like there's no like different worlds get who knows how they get generated, but different worlds come into being, and at the beginning they get some initial conditions and some of these laws chosen at random, and then the rest of the world history unfolds. You might say there's still big, difficult questions, but those questions are maybe not as like weird and mysterious as the question, why do we have regularities, like given the Humean ontology?
Right.
Like they don't completely remove the mystery, but they reduce it.
Right. Right.
And we would say the same thing about divine voluntarism, or I imagine Tom would too. It's not as though there aren't difficult questions that still remain for that view.
Sure.
Right? There's still things that we don't understand. There's still puzzles that can be raised about the nature of God. Like, so you're raising good questions about the view, but I think on their own.
These are deep metaphysical questions. All the views have objections of various sorts, and I don't know. I think I have some bias when it comes to thinking about like abstract objects, that just lots of things about them seem weird to me or something. Because I feel the same way about primitivism. It seems like an odd view to me, but
I mean, I will say this is not something we go into in our paper.
Yeah, sure.
There are different views that one might have about choice of primitives. And so you might think that, if I'm going to posit a primitive law, forget about the fact that we use the word law all the time. If I just tell you, hey, there's some abstract object outside of space and time, and that abstract object imposes structure on nature, but there's nothing else you can say about it, you might think, that feels weird. And you might think that this, my way of describing the relation between universals, you might think, that feels weird. Or you might think, well, positing a God, that feels weird. But there are different lines of thought about what's legitimate and what's not, or what kinds of criteria we might use to judge whether a posit is a good one or not. So somebody like the early modern empiricists would have said, well, you need to be able to provide an account of how we acquired the concept in the first place. So John Locke would have said, look, I at least understand the concept of God, because God is supposed to be a mind, and I understand my own mind through introspection or reflection, and then arrive at the concept of God by basically taking features of my own mind and abilities and amplifying them.
Right.
So there might be a similar way in which we could arrive at the concept of a relation of nomic necessitation or primitive law, but it might feel less familiar to people.
Right.
But there's a lot of discussion about these kinds of issues in the literature, but those aren't actually the ones that
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the way that
I really, I'm an ethicist at the end of the day. So, but yeah. So what is your objection to this sort of view?
I'll give it in two parts. The first part is, it's a little hard to explain if you're not familiar with the details in the literature, but here's like a very rough account of what's going on. When Dretske, Tooley, and Armstrong introduced this theory back in the 70s, they did so with the aid of a bunch of toy examples. So they'd say, all right, suppose it's a law that all F's are G's. Then we could posit a relation of nomic necessitation such that whenever it binds two properties together, everything with the first also has the second. So if we have this relation N binding universals F and G, that will produce the regularity in nature, all F's are G's. And it seems relatively straightforward to say, okay, we've got this thing up here, it somehow oversees what's going on in nature and just produces it very straightforwardly. One of the reasons it's simple is that the expression all F's are G's is just a simple generalization in first order predicate logic. It's very easy to see how you would like get the one thing to then bring about the other in a sense. Right. The laws of modern physics are more complex. They're stated in the language of mathematics. They have this highly functional character. In some situations, they seem to involve derivatives. And there are weird puzzles that arise. So if we're making reference to derivatives of properties, like what is the relationship between a universal and then a derivative featuring that property? Like there's something, it's strange. It's hard to understand how this is supposed to work. So when we think about laws as being or statements of laws as being described by complex mathematical functions, it's a little harder to see how you get a simple relation between them to produce the much more sophisticated regularity. Okay, so that's part one.
Right.
Part two is to say there is a possible solution, but it seems to give rise to a different potential worry. The solution is this, and this is actually following something that Tooley does in his 1977 paper. When you introduce a primitive nomic relation, you have to supply it with the function that it's going to produce.
Right, right.
So for the simple relation of nomic necessitation that turns all F's into G's, the function is just the statement all F's are G's. For the Schrödinger equation, you have all the properties involved in the equation, and then the function is just the Schrödinger equation, and so on and so forth, okay?
Yeah.
So he calls this a construction function. Now, what he's doing is basically saying, look, laws are these theoretical entities. We can plug in any function we want. But if you do that, the worry is that we might have functions of arbitrary complexity, in which case now we don't necessarily have good reason to think that the laws will give rise to regularities that are comprehensible by beings like us. They'll give rise to messier worlds, maybe worlds in which like beings like us couldn't even arise, or very gerrymandered sorts of worlds of the sort you would expect if Humeanism were true.
Right.
The worry is that if you allow anything to go, then this property-based kind of theory gets saddled with some of the problems that beset primitivism.
Yeah, yeah. So the actual laws are not just things of the form. Everything that has this property also has this property. There are these complex mathematical relationships. And so the person who accepts this view can say, well, okay, maybe the relations just involve complex mathematical relationships. Everything that has this property will, when subjected to this force, have this other property and blah, 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 you put in all these numbers. And then the worry becomes similar to some of the worries we were thinking about earlier. Now it's not clear that it actually predicts regularities of the sort that we find in nature, which are, real regularities. It's not just crazy nonsense. It's also not just like something incredibly simple and boring, but it's regularities of this sort that produce these interesting things, or it's not just total nonsense, because it could be, once you're putting in stuff like this, it could be some wildly complicated relationship that produces the incredibly chaotic sort of world that we were worried about for the Humeans. And so once we allow, maybe the thought is something like, once we allow the laws to take forms like this, then it no longer predicts regularities, because there's always going to be some, just like we were saying with primitivism, there's always going to be some possible law that predicts any possible sequence of events. And why is it that we have ones like the ones we have, rather than the much more numerous other laws that predict just crazy nonsense, something like that?
Yeah. So here in particular, Tom and I will want to lean on the comparison to divine voluntarism.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not saying that these theories cannot make sense of functional laws, or that it's impossible for them to account for them. What we're saying is that the character of laws that we have is not necessarily what you would expect if that sort of theory were true.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas it is what you would expect if divine voluntarism were true.
Mm-hmm.
So when you consider, for example, that the regularities in our world can be described using extremely simple, elegant sets of equations, and very, very few of them, that seems like especially the sort of thing that an intelligent being would be interested in. Whereas a universals theory of laws, while given suitable postulates, it might be able to account for them, and maybe not. I still need to think more about this. It might be able to accommodate them, but it wouldn't necessarily be what you would expect, or what would be most likely given the theory. So, if we were just looking at a world that was, I don't know, exhibiting a very simple pattern, like imagine a large checkerboard or something like that kind of pattern. You might say, well, that could be produced by such a simple relation that if you just have properties, and a universals theory might be better than divine voluntarism. But it's because the regularities that we have seem to align so uniquely well with what you would expect if they were designed by a god. That's where we want to.
Yeah, and so you're appealing not just at this stage, you're appealing not just to the bare existence of regularities, but regularities of the sort that we find, which are interesting, very small number of laws that produce very diverse but still predictable phenomena, not just something boring like a checkerboard pattern, or one thing moving back and forth in a straight line, or
So that's really crucial, and it's sort of interesting. We wrote the paper, but we had both been thinking about these issues for a long time. So I had been working for a long time just on thinking about like Humeanism versus non-Humeanism in more general terms. And so I think that you can give, again, this is controversial, but I think you can give a good explanatory argument for non-Humeanism over Humeanism. And I think that if all you say is that there are some kind of patterns out there in nature, that it's quite difficult to, maybe give a defense of divine voluntarism. It would be hard to argue that it's the best version of non-Humeanism. So the specific character of the regularities we have, where they are the sort that make modern science possible, that's really the crucial starting point for the argument. But I think both Tom and I think that if you had relations between universals, you would probably expect some sort of simple patterns in worlds.
And so this is changing track a bit, but so we've been talking about, you said we can sort of divide between views on which regularity, so to speak, is imposed from without, either by God or by some kind of abstract object, and ones on which it somehow arises from within. Maybe views on which objects have causal powers and laws of nature are generalizations about the causal powers of objects or something. That would be one where it sort of arises from within. That one, again, with my tendency towards like the concrete, maybe that one has always seemed like more plausible to me than the stuff about universals and all that kind of stuff. So you think like those sorts of views face problems analogous to those that you've already arisen? Maybe you could give like an explanation of how that is for, say, this causal power type view.
Sure.
You can just sketch it so we can see how
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea behind this view is that when you describe, say, nature, you think of it as like a mosaic where you've got this space-time manifold with different properties at different points. Instead of saying that the properties could be recombined any which way, there's no necessary connections between any of them, you say instead that they have this dispositional character, that they're powers. So, to be fragile is to be such that if something were stressed, it would break. When I say, like I've used a subjunctive conditional, if it were stressed, it would break, that has a kind of modal force or character. So the idea is that a pattern is naturally going to emerge in worlds with a bunch of fragile objects. When they're stressed, they're going to break. So we'll get a regularity out of this. It'll be something like all fragile stressed objects break. And so naturally, as a world of powers or dispositions like proceeds through time, regularities will be produced. So if you want to think of an analogy, suppose you had like a game of dice. There are different ways to cheat in a game of dice. Apparently, if you just practice, you can often like become good at rolling certain numbers. But the other thing you could do is weight your dice. So like a skilled roller of dice would be like the person imposing structure on the outcome of the rolls from the outside, whereas weighting a pair of dice, like it changes the powers or the dispositions of the dice themselves. So the character of the explanation is different. It's coming from different places, originating from different sources. Okay, so there is like an important metaphysical difference. It seems like it avoids some of these puzzles about like the relationship between Platonic entities and nature and stuff like that.
Yeah, the things I was worried about. Yeah.
So why don't Tom and I, what do we think is wrong with this view? Long story short, powers, dispositions, whatever you want to call them, in order for them to do the sort of work that they're supposed to do, they have to be something like universals. So for this reason, we think they inherit the same problems of like the Tully-Dretske-Armstrong universals theory. They're going to have trouble explaining how laws can have the type of sophisticated mathematical character that they do. There are other sorts of like worries in this vicinity, but basically the idea is that building universals into the analysis of laws makes it difficult to then somehow also write a sophisticated mathematical function into the content of the law at the same time.
Okay.
And that's so whether the laws are outside of space and time or somehow like arising out of dispositions of things.
Right.
In both
cases, it's structurally similar, and but in both cases you wind up with relations between universals of some sort. In one case, it's these relations between abstract objects, and then somehow that imposes on the concrete realm. On the other hand, the universals are, more like the kind of Aristotelian conception where they're grounded in concrete objects or something, but you still have this relation between universals that's describing what happens, and then the exact same things that you said about the Tully-Armstrong blah 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 view you can say about this sort of view.
Yep, that's the idea.
Yeah. Okay.
So, and there are other views as well. So there are analogs of primitivism, in a sense. So Like you might say, look, I don't want to posit universals. I want to build some modal character into nature, but I don't want it to have that. I don't want it to be bound by this structure of a universals ontology and things like that.
Mhm.
So here's what I'll do. I'll build it into particulars. For example, I'm just, instead of saying things like, my shirt is dark blue, or my glasses are transparent, or instead of talking about just like observable categorical properties of things and treating those as fundamental, we will treat subjunctive facts as fundamental. So the fundamental facts will be something like, this object would do such and such in this situation. This object would do such and such in this other situation, but it would do something different in this other, and it'll just be this large catalog of subjunctive facts. Now, these are not supposed to be knit together and tied together because there are some universals, because there are some laws. Like, these are supposed to be what is fundamental. And so the worry is that in the same way that primitivism ends up being kind of isomorphic to Humeanism when it comes to the possibilities it countenances, an ontology of primitive subjunctives will be similar.
Right.
Like if you have a fragile vase, that seems like that's because the fragile vase would break if it were dropped or something. But you could have another one that looks exactly like it, but since the subjunctives are fundamental, there's no reason you couldn't say like, oh, well, this one's indestructible. Like categorically, they're identical. It's just a brute fact that one of them would break if it were dropped, whereas the other wouldn't. And so, like for any Humean mosaic you could also build an ontology of primitive subjunctive facts. And so the worry is that like this kind of view is also not going to give us, like, it's not going to explain the regularity of nature because it's compatible with too many wild, irregular, chaotic worlds.
Right.
And so that's, again, it's the same argument we gave for primitivism.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
The big take-home lesson is supposed to be something like this. If you want to explain the regularity we observe in nature, you need a theory that has enough structure to it that it can give a non-arbitrary answer to the question, well, why don't we just get totally chaotic worlds? But it can't have too much structure, otherwise it'll be hard to answer the question, well, why don't we just have these much simpler warring worlds?
Right.
So striking that right balance is what's crucial. And there are lots of non-Humean theories out there, but we think that it's hard to strike the right balance. So
yeah, let's get maybe a final question. So there are other people who have given what you might call nomological arguments for the existence of God before. They go back maybe back to Plato or somebody. People in the early modern period sometimes gave arguments like this. More recently, Richard Swinburne, Robin Collins have defended views like this. What would you say are like the main differences between your argument and maybe the main advantages of your argument over some of the prior approaches? Now that we've laid your argument out.
Sure. I'll also mention, sorry about that. I also want to mention John Foster has a book-length defense of this type of argument and application of the problem of induction called The Divine Lawmaker. So that's another one that's good. I think that all three of these folks, Swinburne, Collins, Foster, have provided really nice arguments. But the one main area in which ours differs from theirs is that it takes a much more serious look at certain competing non-Humean theories.
Right.
So I think that's one of the big steps forward. I think we also try to clarify exactly what the evidentiary statement is supposed to be. So when we say that nature contains regularities, we try to clarify exactly what that amounts to. And so then, things go a bit differently from there. But I recommend work by all three of them as well. So yeah, it's just
yeah, sure. Is there any final comment to make? Any final topic you want to bring up, or?
Nothing comes to mind. I mean, I feel like we've done justice to most of the sorts
Yeah.
of.
Well, this is. I mean, I think I understand the argument better now than I did when I read the paper. Again, I don't have so much background on this in the specific literature on the laws of nature and that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it will be. I think it will be helpful for people in the audience who watch. And yeah, so I think this has been. I think this has been good. Yeah, I think it's a good argument. I think it's a good argument.
Well, thanks. Appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. So
yeah, it's tricky in that. Let me mention one other thing just about what makes this argument different from other arguments for the existence of God. It's an argument where there are many other competing explanations that are readily available that just rely on these different metaphysical entities.
Right.
So I think that kind of helps to explain why it hasn't received a ton of attention, because you really do need to get into the details of the metaphysics of laws and properties in order to evaluate the argument.
Right.
So if you look at early modern statements of this kind of argument, you see them all over the place. They're often sort of offhand, quick little things, because early modern philosophers they were perfectly comfortable. They already had God in their ontology. So if you've got that, why go positing natural kind essences or something? And
right.
So it in that context, it would have just been the natural competing explanation to something like a Humean picture. But the landscape has changed significantly, so you have to do this extra difficult kind of work.
Yeah, I guess that might suggest also a possible synergy with other natural theological art. If there are other reasons to believe in God anyway, but not other reasons to believe in primitive laws or whatever, then that might tilt the balance once we take this into account in favor of the God view as well.
Right. So one thing that I think is interesting about the argument is that although the paper is written as though we're saying, all right, we've observed something, what explains it? It's also I think it does a nice job of illustrating some of the virtues of just the divine voluntarist position. What are some of the things that make it attractive? So if you say are a theist or open to theism or deism or something like that, and you're independently curious about what's going on with the nature of laws, there's an interesting path that can be taken that's here. There's an interesting coherent sort of worldview that can be formed, building God into the picture and describing God's relationship to science. Right. And although we don't go into the paper at all, one of my hopes would be that thinking about these kinds of issues inspires religious believers to be really excited about science.
Yeah, we could use more of that probably.
Yeah. Because if you're a divine voluntarist, scientists are literally investigating the preferences of God in some ways. That's cool. So I would hope that would be one potential takeaway that some people might have.
Yeah, very good. Well, thanks for your time today. And
thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Both Tom and I are really grateful that we were able to do this.
Yeah. I think this has been really good. So
all right.